Okay, everybody, it is our last day for History 181 for the summer. Our last day for video chatting about it. You have until midnight Friday to wrap everything up, take the final exam, anything else that's still outstanding. I'm going to look at the syllabus here right quick with you and go over it to make sure that we are, everything is how it should be. Let me get the screen sharing set up here. Boom, there we go. Okay, so 2020 summer. Let's scroll on down here. So this is August 3rd. It's our last week. So we're going to go over basically, we got a little bit more than just, we're going to go over the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s to the present. It's basically, we've covered a lot of the major things from those time periods, like civil rights and the space program and Vietnam. So we're just going to kind of hit the cultural stuff the rest of the way. So I'm going to save as much time as possible for that. I just want to point out to you that, you have the rest of this week to get everything done. Let me look really quickly on your course content and see if there's anything still out there available. Let's see, again, you have until Friday midnight to take the final exam. We'll talk about that stuff today. You have also until Friday midnight to take both of the video quizzes if you haven't already. The first one is on the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. The second one is on the presidents 1945 through 77. But the quiz is on Kennedy through Ford, which includes Nixon, which I thought was worthwhile. We'll talk about that today. Okay, so that's the three things left that are still possible for you to do if you haven't done them yet. Now let's get on with it. We got a lot to cover today, and we're going to get right to it. So we got to, I wrote it down here last time. Okay, we got up to the 60s and 70s. I'm going to try to go quickly. Yeah, we did Vietnam, Martin Luther King, Kennedy. 60s and 70s. It says insanely brief. That sounds good. Okay, so I got my nice little PowerPoints for this era. So the 60s, there were a lot of the British invasion affecting America, from Doctor Who through the rock and roll and everything. But you also had the 60s Star Trek, 2001, James Bond. So that's the 60s, pretty cool decade. The 60s movement during those years, there's a number of factions, of a number of separate components is the word I'm looking for, of the 60s movement. One was the New Left. This is in politics terms, it was called the New Left. Remember, the old left had been like Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and the New Deal. That was far in the past now. So the New Left in the 60s would be a whole new generation of young people coming into politics and being much more radical, more liberal. You also had a component called the counterculture. This would be like the hippies, the free love, the communes, this kind of thing, typified by Woodstock and everything. Yeah, the hippies. Music, long hair, the drug culture, all kind of emerged out of the counterculture movement of the 60s, which kind of gives the 60s their identity. The sexual revolution during this period, the birth control pill came along in the late 50s, early 60s, which gave women more control over their own bodies and reproductive life, and so they were able to do more what they wanted. This was before, disease got, like AIDS came along. And the communes, I always say this is where the hippies all went and lived in a big house together, and they thought they would all have a garden and grow their own food, but they ended up all growing marijuana. And so for about a month, they're all lying around stoned until they get hungry enough. They all pack up and go back home and cut their hair and took a shower and got a job. And that pretty much brought an end to the counterculture and the hippies. Woodstock is considered kind of the emblematic moment of the counterculture, because this is where all the great musicians of that era, just sort of by, happenstance, came together in upstate New York, at White Lake, New York, at Woodstock, in a big field, and Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and all of that. So it was the big musical cultural moment that typified the 60s. There it is. It wasn't supposed to be that many people there, but the word got out and it just exploded. And there's the hippies. Women's liberation movement was big during the 60s. We already talked about the civil rights movement, so we have to talk about women a little bit really quickly. They were called the New Feminists, carrying on the work of the generations before them, Gloria Steinem and others. One of the things they pushed was the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which was proposed in 72. All the ERA would do would be an amendment to the U.S. Constitution saying that women had equal rights. But it was opposed by many conservative groups, by many Christian evangelical groups. Phyllis Schlafly in St. Louis famously opposed it. There's a mini series that just came out on, I think, Amazon Video or Netflix called, I think, Mrs. America, that's about this whole thing. They have what's her name that played Galadriel? She plays Phyllis Schlafly in it, and there are others that are represented in it. I've watched the first couple of episodes. It was very good. And so the ERA failed because enough people, including a bunch of women, were opposed to it. So we do not have an amendment guaranteeing women equal rights to this day. In class, I would talk more about it, kind of what could still happen with it. It is kind of out there still, but in any case, it's very controversial. Roe v. Wade was the abortion decision of 1973, where the Supreme Court ruled that it ruled what the Roe v. Wade decision says is that states cannot pass laws that prevent women from getting an abortion. I think in the first trimester, there are all kind of state laws that limit it, that constrain it, that surround it, but it basically says they are prohibited from just outright banning abortion in the first trimester. So this was a huge win for the women's liberation movement, because they considered that a woman's right to choose, and they didn't like the government coming in and telling women what to do. 1968 was a very big year because, first and foremost, early in that year, I was born. Yay! Thank you. About the same time I was born, though, a lot of bad stuff was happening. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April 4 we talked about that already, by James Earl Ray. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam, we talked about that, where the Vietnamese communists struck back against the United States in South Vietnam and did a lot of damage. Robert Kennedy, the next brother after John F. Kennedy, he was a senator. He decided to run for president in 68 and was immediately assassinated just like his brother, leaving only Ted, the youngest brother, who just died a few years ago. The Democratic National Convention that year to nominate their presidential candidate was held in Chicago 68, and the protesters all showed up, and there were massive demonstrations, and holy cow, I've been comparing this year to 68, 69 a lot, 67, 68 a lot the last few weeks, and it hadn't even dawned on me that an enormous advantage I think that Biden and Trump both have is that they're not having the big conventions this year that you normally have because of COVID. But think about this. If there had been just the regular conventions, think of all the protesters in the streets that would have shown up, and for either party, I don't know. And my goodness, we could have had 1968 all over again. I'm going to have to mention that. I have to think about that a little bit. That is interesting. So they might both have dodged a metaphorical bullet by not. It might be the best thing that could have happened to them. Either one of them is not having conventions like we had in Chicago in 68, because it could have ended up looking just like that. Wow. I need to remember. I need to think about that. Okay. So with Bobby Kennedy, I'm just making a note. With no Bobby Kennedy, because he was dead now, the Democrats are left. Lyndon Johnson said he wasn't going to run. Bobby Kennedy was dead. So they end up nominating Vice President Humphrey, who was not that popular. And the Republicans nominate former Vice President Richard Nixon, who had lost to Kennedy in 60. And Nixon in the red here defeats Humphrey in blue. More about that coming up. So in the 70s, oh, there's my favorite decade, the 70s. Led Zeppelin from Britain, but they were much bigger in America. And of course, Van Halen, the big 70s, 80s American rock and roll band. The Godfather was just the biggest movie of all time in like 73, until Jaws in 75, until Saturday Night Fever in 77, and of course, the granddaddy of them all, Star Wars in May of 1977, and also Smokey and the Bandit with the CB radio culture, the car culture of the 70s. So there's kind of the pop culture of the 70s, my favorite decade. So Richard Nixon back again, as Billy Joel said. He defeated Hubert Humphrey in 68, and he's going to serve from January of 69 through mid-74. He campaigned saying that while, the hippies and the protesters and the anti-war movement were loud, they were a minority, and he represented the silent majority of people who were not out protesting and rioting and everything. It's amazing how similar 1968 was to 2020. He talked about law and order, just like Trump keeps tweeting, right? This is interesting. Trump is using the same playbook that Nixon used in 68. Guess who one of Nixon's big advisors was in 68? Roger Stone, who was a big Trump advisor, and Trump just got out of prison. So there's enormous ties there. It's really remarkable. They're using the exact same playbook. So the war in Vietnam, we already talked about. That was going on in the 70s. There's Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor. The OPEC oil embargo made gas a lot more expensive and harder to get during the 70s. You can read about that if you want to. I don't have time to really go into it. The Soviet Union, we were in détente. Détente means peaceful coexistence. You're not friends with the Soviet Union, but Nixon was able to kind of get along with them well enough. So détente with the Soviet Union, just kind of settling things down. We're not pointing missiles at each other quite so, rattling the sabers quite so much. In 72, Nixon is reelected over George McGovern, who was not a very popular candidate, and the electoral map's going to blow your mind for two reasons. One, here is, and I'll get to that in a second, and then Nixon goes to China. Nixon had been such a staunch anti-communist that, if anybody else had gone to China and toasted Deng Xiaoping, the premier, that's not Mao, that's, I can't think of his name, one of the secondary Chinese leaders, Nixon would accuse him of being a communist sympathizer. But Nixon himself could go to China because he was such a known anti-communist and start kind of, what Nixon was trying to do was he was trying to pry China away from the Soviet Union, right? Everybody else that didn't understand international relations as well, Nixon was a brilliant international relations president. There's no doubt about that. He was a crook. He was crooked as the day is long, but he was a good international relations president. Other people thought of China and the Soviet Union as just permanently joined together under communism, right? They might as well be the same country. The Chinese communists and the Russian communists were just like that. Nixon understood that while they both had the same political system, they didn't really like each other and they'd never gotten along. So Nixon went over to China and said, hey, China, it's kind of like a love triangle where like there's a guy and a girl that are just, everybody thinks they're just so tight together. And the other guy is like, hey, baby, why don't you come over here for a while? And she's like, oh, what have you got? And he's like, hey, what's going on here? Oh, hey, baby, that's what Nixon did with China. Nixon went to China and said, you guys don't have to be best buddies with Russia. You could be friends with us. We could be very good friends here. Nixon's like, I could do more for you than the Russians could. And the Chinese are like, ooh, we could at the very least, we can make Russia jealous and make them value us more in this relationship, right? So China's like, oh, America, tell me more. And the Russians are like, hey, get your hands off China, America. What are you doing? So Nixon was kind of playing them off against each other. It was very smart. But in that 72 re-election, let me tell you, there's two things about it. One, look at the blowout. Woo! Nixon blew McGovern away everywhere except Washington, D.C., which is actually like right here. And I'm sorry, I'm pointing the wrong map. Except Washington, D.C., which is actually right here. and Massachusetts. That's the only two places that went for McGovern. Everywhere else went for Nixon. So that's amazing. But here's the other amazing thing. Nixon felt the need to cheat to win this election. This is like if the Dallas Cowboys were playing your high school at football, and the Dallas Cowboys said, we probably need 5 downs against this high school. We probably need to cheat. Why Nixon thought he needed to cheat in this election, we will never know. But he did, and he did. So, now this is a specific order this has to happen in for it to make sense, okay? Nixon's running mate in both elections, 68 and 72, was the governor of Maryland, Spiro T. Agnew. I'm not going to ask you that on a test, don't worry, but I just have to explain it for you to understand. Spiro Agnew was the governor of Maryland, a Republican, and he was Nixon's vice president, kind of like Mike Pence with Trump, okay? Former governor of Indiana. But the thing was, investigators were figuring out that Agnew was super, super crooked. He had been taking bribes and extortions of money when he was governor of Maryland, and he was still doing it as vice president, just doing any crooked thing he could to make money off of his office, which is completely illegal. And so the investigators in Washington were figuring this out about the same time that Nixon's illegal activities in this election were starting to come to the surface, thanks to 2 reporters, Woodward and Bernstein at the Washington Post. So the investigators said, if we go after Nixon first, Agnew is going to become president. We don't want Agnew as president because he's even more crooked than Nixon. So the Justice Department, these various investigators, kind of the equivalent of like Robert Mueller last year, they got all the evidence against Agnew together, and they went and sat down with Agnew and said, Mr. Vice President, we have all this evidence of your criminality. You need to resign now. And Agnew said, eek, I'm out of here. And Agnew resigned. So Nixon didn't have a vice president. So they did that by design. You get the second guy first, so that then the first guy, when you get him, you don't get the other bad guy. Okay. So, I guess they could have gone after Agnew once he became president, but it would have been a lot harder with him president. And then you would have had to impeach him, and it would have been a whole big thing. Okay. So Agnew was gone. Nixon didn't have a vice president. Nixon looks around and says, who's the most harmless person that would do me the least damage that I could pick? Hey, Gerald Ford. Ford had been around for a while. He had been an All-American football player for Michigan, a center on the football team. He was he was a very moderate Republican. He was very well liked by Democrats and Republicans alike. He'd been an Eagle Scout. He was just beyond reproach. Everybody thought Gerald Ford is just a nice guy. And so Nixon is like, perfect. I'll pick Gerald Ford. So Ford is appointed vice president. The Senate overwhelmingly agrees. They have to approve, and they do. So Ford becomes vice president. But the investigation of Nixon continues. And then the Watergate scandal erupts. This is the thing they've been investigating. The Watergate was a hotel and conference, still is a hotel and conference center in Washington, D.C., where the Democrats had their headquarters. The George McGovern against Nixon campaign had their headquarters there. And what comes out in you can read about it. I'm not going to go through all the details, but what comes out is that Nixon had agents who actually turned out to be former CIA agents like G. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt. They broke into the Democratic headquarters in the middle of the night to steal stuff they could use against McGovern, kind of like the hacking of the emails, in the 2016 election. And so they were looking for stuff, and they broke into the Watergate. And they got caught. The police caught them in there, and they got arrested. And they said, we're just burglars stealing typewriters. Well, why are you former CIA agents? And they were carrying around Nixon's private phone numbers in the White House. So while the courts are trying to sort all this out, Woodward and Bernstein start investigating, and they get a source famously called Deep Throat, who was a confidential, anonymous source that was giving them information, leading them close. It said follow the money, right? Kept leading them closer and closer. Congress starts investigating as well. Nixon is looking like a crook. He goes on television and says, the American people deserve to know if their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I earned everything I've got. But see, psychologically, when the president says I'm not a crook, people hear Nixon crook, Nixon crook. It's like if I said, don't think of an elephant, you think of an elephant, right? So people began to associate Nixon crook, Nixon crook. His numbers are going way, way, way down. And the Senate's getting ready, the House is getting ready to impeach him. A recording system is revealed in the Oval Office by Nixon's own lawyer. It's kind of like if Michael Cohen had said something incriminating about Trump. And so Nixon's lawyer reveals that everything in the Oval Office has been recorded on audio tape. They pour through them and find what are called the smoking gun, meaning like the incriminating evidence. It incriminates Nixon. They never did find evidence that Nixon ordered the break-in of the Watergate, but they found evidence that he covered it up afterward and tried to what do you call it? Justice, deflection of justice. There's a word I'm blanking out on. Anyway, obstruction. He tried to obstruct justice. Again, same thing they accused Trump of. And in this case, however, the impeachment process begins, and Nixon's aides go to Congress and say, to the Senate, say, how are you going to vote if he's impeached? Almost all of Nixon's own party says we're going to vote guilty. See, this is very different from what happened to Trump. With Trump, all the Republicans said not guilty, all the Democrats said guilty, but you needed 2/3 of the Senate, and the Senate was pretty evenly divided, so he was found not guilty by a few votes. Whereas, the same thing happened with Clinton. Whereas with Nixon, they were all going to vote guilty, and knowing he was about to be convicted, Nixon just jumped out the window. He resigned. This is a scene of his famous speech where he said, my mother was a saint, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes and gets in the helicopter, does the victory sign as he is, in humiliation, having to resign and leave the White House for the last time, go back to California, where he lived out the rest of his life in shame. Now, he could have faced criminal charges. Vice President Ford was sworn in, never elected president, or he's the only president we've ever had that wasn't elected president or vice president. The highest office he ever won was a congressional seat in Michigan, and yet he was vice president and president. And one of the first things he did was issue unto Richard M. Nixon a full and complete pardon for anything he may have ever done. And Ford did that, I think, thinking it would just get the issue off the table, because all that reporters wanted to ask him about his first couple of months in office was, what are you going to do about Nixon? What are you going to do about Nixon? And he was tired of talking about Nixon. He wanted to talk about the economy and, all that kind of stuff. And they kept asking him about Nixon. And so he says, I'm just going to pardon the guy and we're not going to worry about it anymore. But that brought Ford's popularity way down, because people said, oh, I get it. Nixon makes you the vice president, and then when he resigns, you pardon him. Oh, I see. I've never thought, and I've read a lot about this and studied it. I think Ford was too good of a man to go into a deal like that. But you could see how it looked that way, You could see how people that didn't like Nixon and maybe didn't like Ford could read it that way, and it just didn't look good. Ford probably should have just let the process play out, but he just didn't think the country should be put through that. You got to respect that. So meanwhile, Ford's popularity is dropping. His economic issues are terrible. There was what was called stagflation, where we were having inflation and stagnant growth in the economy. So the economy was bad. We did celebrate the bicentennial under Ford. That was nice. The tall ships sailing in New York Harbor, lots of fireworks and everything, 1776 to 1976. And by the way, I haven't heard anybody mention this. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary now. In 2026, it'll be the 250th anniversary of the country. So I'm assuming we're going to have some kind of celebration in a few years. That'd be nice. During Ford's term, Congress really kind of asserted itself and restricted the powers of the president, particularly in terms of military after Vietnam, and investigated the CIA and the FBI. So Ford finishes out Nixon's second term and then runs for his own term, kind of like Truman did after FDR and like Lyndon Johnson did after Kennedy. But he lost to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, former governor of Georgia. It was just a bad year for Republicans because they were blamed for Watergate. And so Ford was already unpopular over pardoning Nixon. And so Carter was able to win. It was the first Democratic president since Lyndon Johnson in the 60s. And he had run basically the anti-Watergate campaign, said, unlike Nixon, I won't lie to you. I'm an outsider. But Carter didn't really know how to work with Congress. He had little legislative success. Here's his election. This is the last electoral map that's ever going to look anything like that. Carter was able to win the Democrats in the North, which are still, these are still Democratic states largely today, and the Southern Democrats in the South. What a strange coalition, right? The liberal Democrats and the conservative Democrats. Again, this is back at a time when the political parties had liberal and conservative wings of both. Whereas like the entire West went for Ford. Now, Reagan got one electoral vote just by an elector from Washington being funny. Ronald Reagan of California, former governor, had run against Ford for the nomination this year and lost. So Reagan's going to sit back, wait 4 years, and try again. This is a very close election, but Carter wins. Maybe the last time the Democrats won Texas. So Carter focused on human rights, and in 1978, he brought the leaders of Egypt and Israel to Camp David in Maryland, the presidential retreat, to sign the Camp David Accords to bring peace between Egypt and Israel, kind of end the major conflict in the Arab-Israeli wars. The Egypt and Israeli leaders, Sadat and Begin, both won the Nobel Prize for this. Carter did not. It was always seen as kind of an insult and a slight to Carter. He should have won one too. And so a few years ago, he's still alive. Carter's still alive. He's like 90-something years old, but he's still alive. Carter was given a Nobel Peace Prize for some other things he did that was kind of seen as like a makeup for them doing him wrong here. In 1979, though, his focus on human rights kind of come back to bite President Carter, because the Iranians have a revolution where they kick out the Shah and his secular government, more or less, and install a religious Muslim government under Ayatollah Khomeini. There he is, Ayatollah. And they took 52 Americans hostage. Now, a number of you watched and wrote a paper on Argo, which is a movie about how some of the hostages got out, but 52 of them didn't get out until over a year later. They were held by the Iranians. They weren't hiding out like the ones in Argo. So Americans were held hostage. 52 Americans were held hostage. And then at the end of 79, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. President Carter, bless his heart, everything is going on bad, and he's not reacting to it well. He also didn't help himself. Carter said, we're going to go to the metric system. And people said, we don't want the metric system. Carter said, we're going to lower the speed limit to 55. People said, I don't want to drive 55. Sammy Hagar said, I can't drive 55. And then the Iranians were burning the American flag. And so the late 1970s, and I remember them very well, were just a time of not economic depression like the Great Depression, but emotional depression. There was just this sense in the late 70s that everything was going bad and everything was turning against the United States, and that we really couldn't do much about it. There was just this general sense of blah in the late 70s. The Carter ordered Delta Force to try to rescue the hostages from Iran. The helicopters collided in the desert, and the soldiers were killed, and the hostages were not freed. And so that was a disaster. And the Iranians made fun of us for it. And then the economy that had been bad under Nixon and Ford continued to be bad under Carter. It wasn't Nixon's fault. It wasn't Ford's fault. It wasn't Carter's fault. It just was that the economy in the 70s was bad for a number of systemic reasons. And so there's Carter's expression by the end of the 70s, not good. There's the helicopters having crashed in the desert, trying to rescue the hostages. And Carter goes on TV. Again, I can't show you these videos this way, but if you go on YouTube and look for Carter Malaise speech, there's like a 2-minute clip of it. It's considered like the most tone-deaf, worst speech a president's ever given. Carter goes on TV and he's like, America's in a malaise. He's banging his fist on the table. America's on his desk. America's in a malaise. We gotta quit this. We gotta get. And people are like, yeah, we're in a malaise because of you, Carter. People were mad at him. And so Ronald Reagan comes back. This time he doesn't have a sitting Republican president to have to go up against in the primaries. And so this time Reagan easily gets the nomination, and he would defeat Carter in the 1980 presidential election. Shortly after Reagan becomes president, the Iranians freed the hostages. Hear me now and understand me later. Carter did all the work to get the hostages out. Reagan did nothing to get the hostages out. The Iranians made a deal over money to get the hostages out in exchange for their assets that had been frozen in American banks, among other things. So Carter gave the Iranians some of their money back, and we got our hostages out. Reagan just got to announce it because the Iranians hated Carter so much that they waited until he left office to actually let the hostages go free. And people from that got the sense that Reagan freed the hostages. No, Reagan had nothing. In fact, if Reagan had tried to get the hostages out as a private citizen before he was president, he would have been violating the law. So Reagan didn't do it. But he got to announce it while Carter looked on, which is terribly unfair to Jimmy Carter. I mean, you can dislike Carter, but you got to be fair. So here's Reagan's big blowout win over Carter. Carter won a few states, his state and his vice president Mondale's state, but electoral vote was humongous. Popular vote was pretty big. And that's going to get us to the 80s. Let's run through the 80s quickly. Got to love the 80s. I put Ready Player One on in my classroom between classes sometime. So here's some pop culture from the 80s. Schwarzenegger, video games, Madonna, Def Leppard, The Empire Strikes Back, Michael Jackson, Prince, Die Hard, Back to the Future, all that is the 80s. I love the 80s too, 70s and 80s both. Those are my decades. Service sector jobs became big in America in the 80s as heavy manufacturing declined. Service sector, we may have talked about this a little bit before, right? This is where people are working behind a desk at a computer, kind of like I am now, rather than out welding cars together or something. So we began to move toward a more high-tech economy in the 80s, away from manufacturing. AIDS was identified as a disease in 1981. It had been killing people for several years, but they figured out what it was. The national debt began to vastly increase under Reagan, and it would continue to this day. Immigration began to be mostly from Latin America and Asia. We wouldn't really have any more European immigration coming over here. The Europeans are very happy with their free health care. They don't really want to come here and lose their free health care. In the 80s, you get home computers in a big way and video games for the first time. You get CD players, cable TV and VCRs, Ataris and television, Space Invaders, all of that. The ARPANET was a military defense-related computer system that was put in place in the 80s. It was combined with the World Wide Web, which was largely developed at the CERN labs in Europe. And together, you get the internet. So the internet didn't really appear until the early 90s for you and me. Certainly for me. I was using the internet as of 1992 for sure. I know I was sending emails in 1992 using that Pine program, which was a black screen with green letters on it. I remember at Georgetown in 92 sending emails. And thinking of something else there. Okay. But the internet really was born in the 80s and came to maturity and availability in the 90s. The new conservative, right? We talked about the new left a while ago, right? The new left was moving away from FDR and Truman to this new liberalism of the 60s and 70s. Well, now in the 80s, you get the new right, the new conservatism. And this was brought in by Ronald Reagan, who was president through most of the 80s. He was supported largely by evangelical Christians who got into politics for the first time and decided they were all Republicans pretty much. One of the main issues that pushed evangelical Christians to decide they were Republicans during the 80s was the issue of abortion, because the Democratic Party favored Roe v. Wade. while the Republican Party largely wanted to overturn it. What this does, though, is causes a domino chain reaction in both directions, where before you had liberal, moderate, and conservative Democrats and liberal, moderate, and conservative Republicans. And now, as this all begins to happen, conservatives all begin to go to the Republican Party and liberals all begin to go to the Democratic Party. This is a major change. This is why I always say that while it's true that George Wallace, the big segregationist, and Robert Byrd, who had been in the Ku Klux Klan, they were both Democrats back in the 50s and 60s. By the 80s, they are most of their kind are Republicans, whereas liberal Republicans pretty much abandon the Republican Party and become Democrats. So prior to the 80s, what divided our two parties was not really ideology, it was other things like geography and stuff like that. Once you get into the 80s, the two parties begin to get very narrow ideologically, and that's what separates them. This is where you start getting liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans, because liberal Republicans go be Democrats and conservative Democrats go become Republicans. So yes, the parties changed very drastically between about the 1940s and the 1980s. They pushed family values, meaning, Christian values, that kind of thing. There's Pat Robertson of the Christian CBN, Christian Broadcasting Network, and Jerry Falwell, televangelists. Reagan wanted a military buildup in the 80s. He was more of a confrontationalist with the Soviet Union, not détente, no more détente. He called the Soviets an evil empire, which is fair enough. He talked about peace not through disarming, but through strength. We will have more weapons to stand up to the Russians. He even wanted Star Wars, as the press called it, a development of a strategic defense initiative, which was anti-missile. In other words, if the Soviets launched nuclear missiles, Reagan wanted a system that could shoot them down. Now, it's virtually impossible. It's never worked. But Reagan got the ball rolling on trying to do it, and the Soviets just didn't have the money to keep up with us in it, so it helped bankrupt their country. The stealth bomber and the stealth fighters were developed in the 80s. I just thought that picture was funny, but it's a good Reagan picture. Economically, Reagan advocated what was called supply-side economics. His own vice president called it voodoo economics. It was supposed to be that if you tax the poor and don't tax the rich, then by not taxing the rich spend all their money on job creation, which lets the money trickle down to the poor. So the idea was the economy does better if you don't tax the rich, you only tax the poor. This was kind of a new thing. In the past, we tended to tax the rich more and not tax the poor as much because, the poor don't have any money. But now we were going to tax the poor in the middle class and not tax the rich and call this supply side, right? You're not taxing the side that's supplying the jobs and everything. So supply side economics. It didn't work at all. It was a complete failure. Now you may say, well, wait a minute. I thought the economy got much better in the 80s. Oh, it did. But the economy recovering in the 80s didn't recover because we were not taxing the rich. In fact, that made it harder because we were bringing in less revenue. We were bringing in less money to pay the bills with. This is like finding out you owe $10,000 on your car, and so you go to your boss and say, boss, pay me less. I want to lower revenues coming into me even while I owe all this money and have all these bills to pay. So if you did that, right, if you told your boss, don't pay me as much, but you still have to pay the bills, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to borrow the money. So Reagan's administration borrowed billions and billions of dollars, just borrowed it. And this is called deficit spending. Deficit spending is you are spending money you don't have. So again, this is like I'm telling my boss, don't pay me as much anymore, and then I'm going and putting all my bills on the credit card. So for 8 years under Reagan, we were racking up the credit card, but it feels great. If you don't believe me, get you a credit card with like a $20,000 limit on it and go out and see how good you feel for a few days, right? You're going to feel good for a few days, man. You're just buying everything you ever wanted, just ching, 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 right? Racking up that credit card. Now tell me how you're going to feel when the bill comes. This is why today this is the beginnings of why today we have a $20 trillion debt. Because starting with Reagan, we just put everything on the national credit card to make us feel better and to make our leaders look like they're doing great things, but actually they're just building up this enormous debt. And every president since Reagan has done it except one, Bill Clinton. You may not believe me. I'll show you numbers in a minute when we get to the 90s. And I'm not here to say anything good or bad about Clinton. I'll just say he's the only one that paid the bills. He's the only one that said, I'm going to actually pay the bills rather than using the credit card. Now, you can love him or hate him for whatever reasons. That's fine. I couldn't care less. But that's the fact. He's the only one had us in the black for about 5 years. Not Obama, not Trump, not Bush, not the other Bush, none of them. Just Clinton. Okay. Also in the 80s, we were engaged in sort of under the surface Vietnam-style warfare against communists in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Grenada, just little smaller places in Central America. Reagan overwhelmingly reelected in 1984 against Walter Mondale, Carter's vice president. That wasn't a brilliant idea. And the first female on a major party ticket. Now, we've had several since her, but Geraldine Ferraro was the first woman to be nominated by one of the two major parties to be vice president. And she would later be followed by Sarah Palin for the Republicans. And then, of course, Hillary Clinton for the presidential spot for the Democrats. Joe Biden has said he's going to pick a woman. Whoever he picks, she will be the fourth woman to be on the ticket of the Republicans or the Democrats in American history. Fourth. This was the first, Geraldine Ferraro. Good for her. And they got killed. They got destroyed. Reagan won a humongous victory. Again, just like with McGovern, Washington, D.C. plus one state. Massachusetts actually wasn't McGovern's home state. His home state was South Dakota. He didn't even win his home state. Now, in Reagan's second term, things get a little worse. It was good that Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, and he actually started working toward better relations with the U.S., but the Iran-Contra scandal, now this is a super complicated scandal, and I would spend an hour trying to explain it, but let me just say, I'll say it as simply as possible. If you want to understand it better, go read up on it, your textbook, whatever. But I'll just say this about it. Reagan was trying to get more, there were more hostages in Iran, they just weren't making a big deal out of it. Reagan was trying to get more American hostages out of Iran, and he was trying to help the anti-communists in Nicaragua, which are both good things. But what ended up happening was he or Oliver North under him in the White House, here Colonel North, basically sold weapons illegally to Iran and used the money to help the Contras in Nicaragua, and they got caught, both of which were illegal, and they got busted doing it. And Reagan, Oliver North was asked about it and said, I was fighting communism and trying to save Americans. What were you doing, Senator? Which was a pretty darn good answer, right? And the American people are kind of like, oh, that's, it wasn't like Nixon trying to help himself. This was trying to help America. And Reagan said, well, I don't remember. I was asleep at the time. I was taking a nap. Nobody told me. And people are like, yeah, I believe that about Reagan, right? If Nixon said, I don't remember, people would be like, he's a liar. But if Reagan said it, people are like, yeah, Reagan probably was asleep. He didn't know. So Newsweek said Reagan's failure, can he recover? And of course, the answer is yes, he recovered. Oliver North went to prison, but Reagan recovered pretty much. So Reagan would leave office and and the next president would be his vice president, George H.W. Bush, the dad of the later President Bush. He won in 88. He promised, read my lips, no new taxes. But he still had to deal with the deficits of Reagan, and the national debt was huge. He defeated Michael Dukakis, by the way, but I'm not going to go into all that. There's Dukakis in a tank, a famous joke. We got the savings and loan crisis during the 80s, a horrible economic situation with the savings and loans all going broke because of bad government deregulation. We went into an economic recession because of all the debt. Bush raised taxes after saying no new taxes. Republicans got mad at Bush for doing what he said he wouldn't do. The one really cool thing that happened under the first Bush was the end of the Cold War. People kind of credit Reagan more for this, but it happened under Bush. And Bush was like Nixon, Bush was a very good foreign policy. I would argue that George H.W. Bush was the best foreign policy president we've ever had. And he managed the end of the Cold War masterfully. In the fall of 89, the Eastern European communist dictatorships collapsed, like in East Germany there, tearing down the wall. And the Soviets didn't intervene. They stayed out of it. The Germans began tearing the wall down while the East German troops just looked on and did nothing. It was shocking. It was one of the most shocking things I've ever seen in my life. I was in college. Germany was reunited, East and West. Remember that was the division that we saw after World War II? That's gone now. Bush sat down with Gorbachev and agreed to massive reductions in nuclear weapons. And at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed and would be replaced by Russia and 14 other little countries like Ukraine, like Lithuania, right? These are all countries that came out of the Soviet Empire, but Russia was the big one, and that's their flag. Okay, that gets us through the 80s. Now, our last stop is the 90s to the present. We can do this in about 5 or 10 minutes, I think. It will be good. So there's the 90s in pop culture, from Beanie Babies to Phantom Menace to Jurassic Park to Michael Jordan, Pearl Jam, Titanic, all that. So while the Soviet Union was collapsing and everybody's attention was on that, Saddam Hussein of Iraq decided to invade his little neighbor Kuwait to get their oil money. So we get the Gulf War. And President Bush puts together a global military coalition through the UN to try to push back Saddam. He's bad, Saddam. So we attack Iraq on January the 16th of 91. The U.S. and our allies attacked Iraq with UN permission, kind of like in Korea. It's called Operation Desert Storm. Iraq almost immediately surrendered. There's their highways, their vehicles blown up, the highway of death, blown up by the American A-10 Thunderbolts, the Warthogs, awesome planes. And so at this point after that Gulf War, President Bush was super popular, and nobody was even wanting to run against him. He was easily going to get reelected. But see, all of that happened in the first year and a half of his 4 years, and then it all settled down, and people are like, well, the economy's kind of bad now, Mr. President. What are you going to do about it? Nothing. And so the economic downturn happens. His popularity goes from 90 plus to 30 plus. Absolutely amazing. Both of these records would be beaten by his son later, high and low. We'll get to that in a minute. And so with his popularity drastically dropping, we get Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who beat Bush and the third-party independent candidate Ross Perot, billionaire. I'm Ross Perot. I got $3 billion. And, Clinton talked about change in the economy and all that, but he had personal scandals he was able to kind of get past and win the election. He was the first baby boomer president. George W. Bush would be the next, followed by Trump. I would consider Obama to be the first Generation X president, but it just depends on where you draw that line. And he introduced us all to his wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who we will see again. So here's that weird Clinton-Bush-Perot map where Clinton actually won the Democratic states plus some southern states because he was from Arkansas. So that's a pretty good win for a Democrat in 1992, Clinton. And there they are back in the 60s. I love that picture. So NAFTA and the WTO were two global economic systems that Clinton was able to get passed by Congress. Those were good accomplishments at the time. Strong economy in the 90s. We were paying the bills. And like I said, we didn't have any deficits during 5 of his years. He left office with us in the black. And then he's reelected in 96 over Bob Dole. But he's impeached over lying about Monica Lewinsky, his affair, in his second term. He's acquitted. All the Democrats voted not guilty. It was just like Trump in reverse. All the Democrats voted not guilty. All the Republicans voted guilty. And like I said, he had budget surpluses. He actually brought in more money than he spent. Very good economic president. And here's the proof. Here's the budget deficits under Carter, under Ronald Reagan, under George Bush, under Clinton, we go up into the black. And then under Bush the second, we go back down again. Under Obama and under Trump, it just goes down, down, down. So in 2000, Gore, the vice president, after 2 terms, runs against the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, the son of the former president. They run against each other. And in one of the most controversial elections of American history, Gore and Bush were tied. Whoever won Florida would win. And Florida was so close that it took a month to figure out who won. The Supreme Court finally stepped in by a 5-4 vote and picked George Bush as the winner, which means that Bush won the presidency literally by 1 vote. Isn't that crazy? So the Supreme Court ordered the vote recount to end and Bush wins. There's the division. It's just dead even. You got all the population in those states versus a whole lot of states here. So it ended up being 50.5 to 49.5 in the electoral vote. Again, if you took Florida away from Bush and gave it to Gore, Gore wins by a lot. So it was that close. For about 9 months, Bush was unpopular. He was considered an illegitimate president by many people. And then you got 9/11. The terrorist attacks in New York that blew up the World Trade Center, and also in Washington, D.C. that hit the Pentagon. And, of course, the country rallied around Bush and the war on terror, where we attacked Afghanistan and then eventually Iraq. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were seen as responsible. And there's the 2 buildings on fire and exploding as the planes flew through them. And so the U.S. in 2003 felt like we needed to do more than just go after Afghanistan. We need to pick a bigger Middle Eastern country that we didn't like and beat the snot out of them so that nobody would attack us again like this. That was the thinking. And so Bush orders the invasion of Iraq. Iraq hadn't done anything to us in a while, but we didn't like Saddam, and so we went after them. It was opposed by our allies. We had no UN permission to do it. We went in anyway. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said, "This is our new doctrine of preemptive wars. We will attack you if we think you might be a danger to us in the future." That was totally contrary to the American tradition for over 200 years, where we only attack when we get attacked first. But whether it be Pearl Harbor or whether it be like the Gulf of Tonkin, right, for Vietnam. But in any case, we decided we were now just going to attack countries when we felt like it. So we did. A quick military victory, of course, because who would have think that, nobody would say that Iraq was going to hold out against us for long militarily. We captured Saddam, and their own new government executed him. We go into this long nation-building insurgency civil war in Iraq. A religious war kind of breaks out between the Sunnis and the Shiites. Bush declared mission accomplished before any of this happened, and so he started looking kind of dumb that he declared victory. And then we get into all this long, thousands and thousands of American soldiers died after the war was over in what was called the insurgency, with those the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices and everything. So in 2004, John Kerry of Massachusetts, the senator, runs against Bush, and Bush wins a second term. By the way, interestingly, this is the only presidential election since today, from 1988. From 1988 until today, this is the only presidential election where the Republican candidate got more votes than the Democrat. Because think about it. In 92, Clinton got more votes. In 96, Clinton got more votes. In 2000, Gore got more votes, but the Supreme Court picked Bush. In 2004, Bush got more votes than Kerry. But in 2008, Obama got more votes. In 2012, Obama got more votes. And in 2016, Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes, but the Electoral College went for Trump, as that's how it works. So this is the only time since 88 that the Republican got more votes. It's pretty remarkable. In 2007, I had to mention this, right? We get the iPhone. That changes, as you walk around running into walls on your phone in the halls. That's when that all started. I do it too. So here's the 2004 electoral vote. You can see it was very, very close between Bush and Kerry. If Kerry had won Ohio, that was the deciding state, like Florida in 2000. It was Ohio in 2004. Kerry would have won. Of course, you know that in 2008, with the economic downturns, we have what was called the housing bubble burst. Barack Obama was able to defeat John McCain for the presidency, our first African-American president, who served 2 terms. There's his really big win. This is the biggest win a Democrat got since 64 Lyndon Johnson for Obama. And then in 2011, Obama completed the withdrawal of troops from Iraq that we had been working on since 2003. It tied Vietnam for our second longest war. And there was actually a victory parade in St. Louis in 2011. We're the only city that did it. 2012, Obama defeats Mitt Romney for his second term. Little closer, but still a pretty good win for Obama and Biden. And the social political movements that emerged in the late in the late Bush and throughout the Obama terms up until now include things like the Tea Party that was against the deficits. Although it's interesting, by the way, through 8 years of Barack Obama, the Tea Party just railed against budget deficits. And as soon as Donald Trump took over, we have at least as big a budget deficits every year under Trump as we did under Obama. I haven't heard a peep out of the Tea Party. They're just vanished. I don't know what it is about Obama that's different from Trump, that the Tea Party didn't like Obama doing the exact same thing that Trump is doing. I can't put my finger on what's different about Obama and Trump. I don't know, but something about them is different. Anyway, so Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, which is kind of like, going against the 1%, having all the tax breaks and getting all the benefits when the economy collapsed and we got nothing. And then, of course, Black Lives Matter, which is still around today and have come back out again in a big way with the events of the last few months, certainly. And then in 2016, our most recent presidential election, we're going to have another presidential election in about, August, September, October. 3 months, just a little over 3 months from now, we'll have the 2020 election, Trump versus Biden. But this was quite a remarkable election. Clinton led the polls all the way start to finish, got 3 million more votes, and yet Trump was able, by an 85,000 vote majority in three or four states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, and Wisconsin, 4. He was able to win. If you flipped 85,000 votes in those states, Hillary Clinton would have won. So better for worse, whatever. So she lost, and I think, yeah, there it is. So these are the states that Democrats always win, but that Trump was able to win. And to his credit, that was enough to do it, and that gave him 306 to 232. If you take those away from Trump and give them to Hillary Clinton, she wins pretty easily. So there's the 2016 election, and then we get to the impeachment, of course. But we're kind of out of time, and I'm not going to ask you about that on the test because it's too recent. That's just like current events right now, which I think gets us to the end. All right. So very quickly, let me tell you what oops, closed the wrong folder. Bear with me 1 second. And let me flip back to here. So for the exam, you'll have like 50 multiple choice questions, and then your essay options. You only answer one essay question, but your options are the Civil Rights Movement, or the Vietnam War, or the 80s, the 1980s America. All right, so you'll pick one of those. I'll have some specific questions about each of those, and you pick the one that you want to answer on your test. All right, I think that's right on time. Wow, we brought that sucker in for a landing at 10:59. So I will see you guys. Make sure you take the test by midnight Friday. I got to go. Send me an email if you have any questions, and I'll see you for